Hello, hello. Welcome to the Drupal 7 End of Life podcast. I almost forgot the name of the podcast that we're recording.
I'll
I'm
start
Mark
that way.
Dorison. I'm joined by Chris Free,
Hey,
and
good morning.
today Matt Glaman is our guest, or first return guest to the podcast. Matt is the author of Retrofit for Drupal, which we're going to talk about today. We first spoke about Retrofit in May of this year, many months ago, before DrupalCon. It didn't even have its name yet, but we're in a different spot now. Retrofit's in a different spot, so we're going to get an update on where things stand and how Matt feels about things. Matt, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
So it's been months. It's been a number of months. I can't count them this quickly in my head, but it was May. It's September now. And when we last spoke, we didn't even call Retrofit. We were calling it, what were we calling it?
Drupal Bridge? I was calling it the Drupal Bridge.
And so I think Retrofit is a pretty great name and definitely an upgrade over Drupal Bridge. I'm curious, did you already have that in mind, or how the name came about?
Yeah, I was just thinking about it, and it went from being this wild idea to this could actually solve a problem. Once I proved it could work and do things, I was like, all right, well, it needs a better name than just Drupal Bridge, because it wasn't just bridging. And I actually don't know where I got the idea for the name, but Retrofit fit in because the idea is that you can take something old and make it work in something new. And that's exactly the point behind Retrofit, is to take your existing code and just plug it into the newer systems and get rolling. And it just worked out.
For folks that aren't familiar with Retrofit, maybe they didn't hear our previous episode, can you sort of give an overview of what Retrofit is trying to achieve?
Yeah. So the goal of Retrofit is that people have invested time and money on Drupal 7 platforms in their custom code. They've built applications. And now when it comes time to move into Drupal 10, you have to rewrite that code to match the new APIs based on Symfony and other changes. Well, that means that you have to touch every line of code about to make it work with modern versions of Drupal. And Retrofit wants to reduce that amount of code you have to change. So it provides a backwards compatibility layer for various APIs, such as the routing layer. Forms can even work. So a lot of form API between 7 and Drupal 10 hasn't changed much, except that it became object-oriented when it's built. So there's a backwards compatibility layer that executes your Drupal 7 form code, and it runs mostly fine in Drupal 10, but you might have to change some of the specifics in the code. But it can just be built. You need to go and delete your hook form implementations, then create a class. You could just run your existing code and make the tweaks in the internals, and to reduce a lot of that boilerplate code changes that you'd have to do.
So when we last spoke, it was right before DrupalCon. DrupalCon occurred, and that's when Retrofit really made its debut. What has been, and that was the same week at DrupalCon when the updated Drupal 7 end of life announcement was made, with a new end of life date, the hard, firm commitment for end of life. And I think it was all kind of, it made sense that all this just happened to be going on, at the same time. What has been the response that you've heard from Retrofit as far as, commentary on the tool as far as functionality and also, its existence in general?
Yeah, so there have been a few people that have come out to me and just given private feedback, because organizations, especially the ones I'm talking about, that invested hundreds of thousands or $1 million on the Drupal 7 platforms, well, they stick to quarterly schedules. They're not going to be, their developers aren't going to pick it up and start playing with it, but there might be contractors who experiment with it. But I've heard feedback from one platform that it would save about $300,000 in development effort, just for the fact that they don't need to rewrite every single line of code. Even if it touches 30% of their code, 30% of the code just stays the same. They run it and then have to make some live tweaks. It's going to reduce the amount of code that they have to rewrite. Also, the cognitive load in reviewing the code. Because I've been on a few Drupal 7 to Drupal 10, or even other PHP platforms to Drupal. And a lot of the issue is just you're touching lots of code, which means that you're possibly creating lots of bugs with the business logic that used to just work, right? It just worked. Maybe there's a few issues, but now you've touched every little part of it and your confidence is gone. And that's the idea, is to keep that confidence in your platform with the code that builds your platform as doing this major version of it. So
I think
no
that's
organization
an interesting. I think that's an interesting piece of the puzzle. Is I think many people, when they're approaching an upgrade like this or a tool like this, evaluating, they're thinking like, well, it's either all or nothing. Like, why? Or even when they're looking at retrofits, say like, well, but it doesn't do X, Y, or Z. It does A, B, C, but what about X, Y, or Z? And I think what you pointed out is sticking with me, that, you know, in these big projects, even an incremental improvement, even an incremental, you know, something that helps incrementally can be a massive asset. So if it helps, you know, 40% or 60% of the upgrade, like that could be a huge deal, whether or not it does 100% of the thing. Is reaching 100% the goal with retrofit, or, you know, is that even possible?
I'd say no, because thinking of all the sites that I worked on, a lot worked with Panelizer and this Chaos Tools API. There's no way that I think I could write any compatibility layer that bridges from Panelizer and Drupal 7 to whatever is in Drupal 10 that was kind of replaced by Layout Builder and Drupal Core. So there are going to be parts that can't be compatible. But what if that was your problem? What if at the end of the day, your problem is like, oh darn, we built this form that created a node that had Panelizer. Instead of having to rebuild the form and the logic for creating the node, it was just, okay, the part that scaffolds the Panelizer configuration. That's not all you had to touch. That's only 1/3 of the process. So that really increases your velocity. And it's not saying that you have to live with the retrofit forever, but what it lets you do is, instead of saying you have 1 year to do everything, what if it's 3 years? What if it helps you iteratively fix all of those things over multiple sprints? Because let's face it, when you're upgrading, you have a living, breathing platform that has bug fixes and feature requests that you're also upgrading, which means that you have to keep building on the old platform and the new one. And this lets you kind of do that simultaneously, or not lose that effort or create double. It's all about not being the silver bullet that will fix everything, but just making the process easier and more scaled.
Yeah, I think too that you could, without something like retrofit, you could spread your upgrade development effort over 3 years. But the difference is you won't have modern Drupal live until the end of that 3 years. Retrofit would allow you to get it live much earlier in the process, and then iteratively, you know, convert some of this, you know, retrofitted Drupal 7 code to native modern Drupal code.
Yeah. And one of the recent changes was adding support for themes. So I was focusing more on a lot of the module APIs, such as forms, blocks, field formatters. And then some of the feedback was, well, what about themes? Because let's face it, a lot of themes have a lot of business logic in them. Or, you know, I always associate upgrades to, they're going to redesign the site. Well, why is it? Retrofit is changing the paradigm, so why should I expect that same paradigm for Drupal 7 to Drupal 10? Why should it require a theme rebuild? Will it be perfect? No. But if you have PHP template files that are overriding things, they are picked up and they work. You know, I had a few fatal errors because some things don't match the same ways, but I have a Drupal 10 site rendering Bartik from Drupal 7, and it's showing up. Like, it's not the best, but it is there, so you can go in and start tweaking and adjusting. Some of the feedback has been, well, then you have Franken Drupals running around, or you're going to have more effort patch that. Like, but is it really more effort? What's more effort, rewriting or running something and then reconnecting the bits? Like, oh, I have an error here. I'll fix that one error instead of rebuilding it and wondering why it's not working at all.
having Franken Drupals is a funny thing because every client that comes through our door has a Franken Drupal. They have custom code that was written poorly and doesn't follow APIs. And so like they're all Franken Drupals. Drupal itself is about combining pieces from other developers and stuffing them together to make something that is alive. Pardon the reference there. But that's what Drupal is. Like you're stuffing things together. And we're seeing so many clients coming through the door who feel stuck because they've waited this long because the upgrade is too great. And now they feel really trapped and they're thinking, okay, in sort of Mark's framing that it's all or nothing. Either I stay on Drupal 7 and I live with the consequences of that, or I have to all at once upgrade to Drupal 10. And no, I can't afford that. And so this tool is, as the person who's heading up sales at Chromatic, I love this tool. I can say, what if I had a middle ground for you? Something that would help save X% of your initial investment and let us over time use your budget and your dollars to get you completely off of the Drupal 7 island. So, cheers to you on that one.
Yeah. And what if we
I
could
think it's worth noting
upgrading...
too, you mentioned... Go ahead, Matt.
That's it. What if we can take upgrading Drupal from like a major version, like thought of Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, 9, 10 as like a major feature? What if that can be relegated to being a maintenance task? Like we consider 8, 9, 10 upgrades now. Like there's still work to be done with major version upgrades, but it's considered more of a maintenance task than like, okay, let's create a war room. And so what if we can get Drupal 7 to modern Drupal be the same, thought of as the same way?
Yeah.
You mentioned a moment ago, how when you started, you were assuming that, oh, well, when you're upgrading, there's usually a redesign. And I think that that's interesting and causes me to consider like, well, why? I think the same thing. But I think part of the reason why is because in some ways it was forced with the Drupal 7 upgrade. It was like, well, you're going to have to rewrite this theme anyway. Do you want to spend all this time and money re-implementing the same thing you had? Or, is this theme long in the tooth, this design long in the tooth, and you are really hoping to do a redesign in the near future anyway? Let's, take this opportunity. So you try to spin a negative into a positive and figure out like, well, how do we make this an opportunity? But you are, once again, it's like adding one more layer of, a big layer of work and effort. And now you're not just rewriting the theme, but you're redesigning, you're starting from scratch, you're dealing with all of the new, issues that are going to arise from that. So to be able to, I think the theme retrofit for the theming layer is a big deal to be able to say like, nope, we can focus on getting on modern Drupal, and there's going to be some theming work that needs to be done, but we can realistically keep the same theme running. And then 6 months, a year down the line, when you're really ready for that redesign, now let's re-implement the theme natively. And I think that's a huge asset, maybe the biggest potential asset, because that theming layer being sort of a separate beast, to be able to do that work when it makes sense for the business is a really big deal.
Yeah, I'll be really excited when people pick up and try that.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Matt.
Listen, I'll be really excited when somebody picks this up and does some thorough testing with a theme, because one of the feedback that I got is, well, what about the fact that Drupal 7 you'd have 3 layers of themes, the Omega theme, and then the Alpha theme, and then you sub-theme that. So it is extremely complex. Again, the idea is not to solve everything at once, but just, is it a little bit easier? Instead of having to rewrite it, is it just, hey, it runs, and like I said, reconnecting some dots, because things aren't exactly the same, but you don't have to touch every single line of code.
Matt, can you, for the more technical listeners and those curious, i.e. me, can you explain technically how it works? Like because what you say sounds like magic to me. And so I'm curious, just like from 50,000 feet, how does it actually work? How can you prove to the engineer who might be listening to this thinking, yeah, that sounds great, but I really don't believe that's going to solve my problem, or that sounds too good to be true. Like, how can you explain away, not a way, but how can you explain, how does it technically happen? Like, how do you make your claims about retrofit actually come true?
So one of the beautiful things about Drupal, like modern Drupal, is having the service container. That's like the registry of all the things. Drupal, normally you have to write a services.yaml file, but there's actually a way to register a class that can tap into the building of the container. And so when you install Retrofit, it tells Drupal, hey, I have a service provider here. So when you build the service container, I want to register or alter things. So that's how it hooks in. So for instance, let's say for the theming part, because that's the most magical one. So if your module has a hook theme, it will read the hook theme and know to take your theme function and wrap it in a Twig template. And it does this by decorating the theme registry service. So if you're not familiar with like decoration, in object-oriented, there's like inheritance where you extend classes, or you can use decoration where you wrap classes. So that's the approach a lot of this takes, is it takes existing core services and wraps them and says, well, once you're done processing, I'm going to do a little bit more, or I might do a little bit before you process things. So in the case of the theme registry, it decorates the theme registry service and says, all right, if you're processing a module, check these certain signatures, and if it matches, this was a theme function, will actually map to our Twig template. And then if it's a theme that's being processed, which I just recently wrote a blog post because I had no idea how to detect template overs. Like, I know it works, but I didn't know how it actually worked. So again, I decorated that process. When the theme registry is processing the theme engine, so it says, hey, Twig, tell me what templates exist. That process is what finds templates, overrides, and themes. So then I had to implement a similar process that said, all right, well, go look for .tpl.php files, and then make sure those are executed via our Twig template. And under the hood, we have Twig templates that are rendering your legacy template code. So that way there's no, we're not like running PHP template. It's just executing it the same way, but within Twig. But as a caveat there, just because it's being executed by Twig doesn't necessarily give it a lot of Twig security features. So PHP template, that's one thing I want to figure out. And PHP template didn't escape output, so it always had like that security issue. Like, what if you proc content? Just because it is being executed in Twig doesn't mean it's going to magically fix any of the 7 issues on templating. I just wanted to add as a caveat if somebody hears that and goes, "Oh, great." One thing is solved.
Yeah, that's
to clarify that, is it worse off than things were in Drupal 7 with PHP template, with those templates running in Twig, or is it just the same and you're not getting the benefits of the Twig security?
I would say it's I don't want to say it's worse off. It's a little less. Because Drupal 7, there is an issue about this, but in Drupal 7, there were pre-processed functions which sanitized known user input, like field labels. That's actually what the issue is about. And the field labels in D7 were always stripped for cross-site scripting tests. Retrofit isn't doing that yet. So there is that actual risk where some of the layers where Drupal would pre-process to try to strip out things, those have not yet been ported to Retrofit. So that is some of the gaps.
That could happen in Retrofit. It's just not happening yet.
Yeah. So there's plans to find a mitigation for it, because right now it's very much, let's find the biggest surface areas so that way people can use it and verify if it works or not, and then start to chip away at those. What did Drupal 7 do that Retrofit could now bring back in?
What else, in terms of, you just said Retrofit doesn't do that yet, what other things are on the horizon for Retrofit that you want to focus on, or maybe even want some help focusing on? So can you talk a little bit about that?
I know I've been focusing on themes, and I think that's in an okay spot for now. But one thing I know, I always wrote custom field types and field widgets and field formatters, and that could be done. We already do it for blocks. So it finds your hook block infos and maps its own block plugin class. So I think that could be easily supported supported as well for custom field types. Might be a little bit more tricky because fields have like a look schema that you'd all have to try to parse in. But I think field types would be a great one. And then finding more real world examples, because I haven't worked with Drupal 7 since 2015, maybe 2016. So it's not like I have code bases later on I can look at. Or if I do, they're all like Commerce Kickstart and Drupal Commerce. And that'd be extremely hard to do, because that's like, oh, let's talk about C tools and the token module and rules. So finding more test cases is the biggest one. But again, I'm patient because I know test cases come with people adopting. And this can be announced at DrupalCon when everybody thought they had 1 year left or 6 months left, however it was. Now they've got an extended deadline. So they're making plans and knowing it's a bit more serious. So it's kind of just poking at things that help shore up the code and are kind of large APIs and just help prove that, yes, this can tap in and help you run things.
Awesome.
Well, I could think of one site that we could try this on. It might be a little complex, but Drupal.org is still on Drupal 7. We could clone that.
What is the status of that? Are they going to meet the deadline? Like, what is the plan there?
I don't know the answer to the second question, but they're hard at work on a bunch of tasks that are going to unlock, getting Drupal.org onto Drupal 10. I know they're very focused. The Drupal Association is very focused on, not duplicating a bunch of work that is very nearly immediately going to go away. So, for example, issues are moving to GitLab. So they don't want to spend time, recreating a bunch of issues code on Drupal 10 and then shut it off in the near future. So there's a couple dependencies that are blocking, or that the issues migration is dependent on. Things like automatic updates and things like that, but all that work is moving forward, and I know they're working very hard on it.
So does Retrofit work against Drupal.org? I'm guessing no. We're going to have some white screens of death and
that would be
fatal errors. But
really interesting, because I know one part that I've wanted to work with is entities. And this is being proved out with configuration entities. I know there was recent code I wrote, and it had an idea of it wraps entities so that way you can access them like the old way when it was like a non-class object. It was just like, hey, it's a standard object that has some properties, and there you go. It wasn't actually against a class. So there is code in there to add compatibility to it. And I believe I did it for blocks. It was block config as part of theming, because Bartik in a pre-process loaded a block and did like arrow property. And it's like, okay, well, let's make sure that it can interact with config blocks the same way that you did in Drupal 7. So that is a huge API that I would love to explore. That's actually what I wanted to go to first, like field get items and just making entities work. But then I realized that's how I did Drupal. And I don't think I did Drupal like most Drupalers did Drupal when I worked with Drupal 7. I was using autoloaders and having everything in object-oriented because I didn't like how Drupal 7 did work. I loved the software and I loved the community, but I know I was not a typical developer. So I've tried to break what are the scratch I want to itch, or the itch I want to scratch rather. I'm trying to think about what would have the biggest impact for other orgs.
I would say too, Chris, you just made a joke about like, oh, we would probably have a bunch of white screens of death. But I want, to sort of frame, what Retrofit is capable of. Like, would you agree, Matt, that if you load up Retrofit on most or many Drupal 7 code bases, like there's going to be white screens of death, like, and that's not a failure of Retrofit. If, assuming Retrofit isn't trying to hit 100% coverage of Drupal 7, what it will do is turn, 250 white screens of death into 30 white screens of death that need to. Is that sort of a different way of explaining what the goal is here?
Yeah. And so getting a fatal error when you load the code tells a different story. What if you built from scratch and like, it's not working? Like I had my code in this old hook and I wrote it to the hook, but it's not running. And I know it should. But what if with Retrofit it did run and you got a white screen of death that said, hey, in your code at this line, you're accessing this and it's null, or it's not an object, or it's not an array. It's going to give some arbitrary error that might make your head scratch, but you know where to look. Like, oh, my code's running. Great. It doesn't run the same way anymore. What do I have to change? You'd be doing that anyways, right? If you're porting your code from Drupal 7 to Drupal 10, you're going to do that same process, but not have the baseline of having a lot of things already executing. So that's why I keep saying, like, reconnecting dots, like fixing the wires. Your code is running, and it almost allows you to be more pinpoint and start working on things right away. What if your first sprint was, okay, everybody, we're going to redefine the routing system and all of our custom endpoints. Instead, you plug it in and you have those, and I'm going to run the code and what happens. And I follow a very test-driven development format, and that's how I think of Retrofit. It lets you just, you have your test case, okay, you manually work in the site, and then you have the code. Well, refresh page, crash, okay, go fix the code. Did it fix it? And you can start iteratively getting immediate feedback on your code working in Drupal 10.
Yeah, it's sort of the difference between working with a scalpel and working with a machete, and beyond that, you don't have the manual coder variable, right? Like, I need to take all this Drupal 7 logic and rewrite it over here, and then hope prayers later, run it in a browser and see what happens. And like you say, it's like, well, yeah, maybe it's not working, but where is it broken? You don't really know. Maybe you don't get a white screen of death, but you don't know if your business logic is, did you have a false when you need a true or something like that? With what you're proposing with Retrofit is you can see exactly where your code does not fit within Retrofit and make a couple of changes. And then, okay, now we know we're working, and I touch so much less code that I have a lot more confidence in this code. So even if you don't have tests or anything, you can have a lot more confidence that, all right, well, I only touched 10 lines versus writing 1,000 lines over. So yeah, I think it's a no-brainer for anybody who's in this position to give it a shot and see what you can get going with Retrofit. Absolute no-brainer.
And it'll be nice to get some feedback on folks that are like, oh, this is missing. Like, let's take tools panes and panels. Those are all should be considered blocks. And is that the fix? Is have them show up as blocks, or is it one of you need to create a custom block, but hey, if you copy paste that code into your blocks content, it should run just fine. Your D7 code paste into a D10 block could just work. Or I've been on a lot of sites that had a page manager. Page manager exists in Drupal 10. So right now the code base does live underneath my personal GitHub as Retrofit-Drupal, and I'm creating a GitHub. I created a GitHub organization called Retrofit-Drupal, and so the current code base will be called Core. So it'll be Retrofit-Drupal core, and let's say there is CTools, so it could be like Retrofit-Drupal /CTools. So that way it might be a management nightmare, but the idea being that it's easier for growth. So that way the core package could focus on certain things, but if there are like specific contrib or, what if this spins out to being a bigger project, there's ways to grow the management or bring in like co-maintainers as well, because GitHub organizations makes that easier. Or, one thing I want to start offering is private support, because this is like a personal endeavor and it is a big thing and people will need support. So I'm trying to adjust the scaffolding a little bit in the organization to make it grow as people adopt it.
So how can people help out in the near term if people are interested and they are maybe they're trying it on a Drupal 7 site of their own? What are the different ways that they could, help the project?
So right now it's on github.com/mglaman/retrofit-Drupal, and you could clone the code, give it a try, or rather, there's instructions on how don't just clone the code and try it. There's instructions on how to build a Drupal 7 site test or a Drupal 10 site. with Retrofit for Drupal and start testing your Drupal 7 code. And if you find an error, to open an issue, say, oh, I hit this. You don't need to copy and paste your private code, but some ways to reproduce of, oh, I tried the theme feature and I had a pre-process for my region, and in Drupal 10, regions don't have this anymore, but in Drupal 7 they did. Like some of those quirks and just assumptions, because that is one thing I found out. In Drupal 7, breadcrumb, page title, those are all part of pre-process. In Drupal 10, they're blocks. So they don't exist anymore. And those are there's a lot of minute details, and not everything had a change record. I tried looking, a lot of the early Drupal 8 stuff, the change records are pretty wide or not increased. So things like that, just trying it, say, hey, I ran the page, I got an error here. You don't need to necessarily share code all the time, but just say, tried it, this is one place that broke. And that can help guide a direction. And also like think of it like influencing roadmap. We used it, this is where it broke. And if a bunch of people say, yep, I agree, well, that's where things can get fixed. Or it is open source. I plan on always keeping it open source, so you can create a pull request if you want to just jump in and help build it.
So pull request welcome.
Pull requests definitely welcome, but so are issues. It sounds like this should always and often the case, but we emphasize here that with the place that Retrofit is in now, there's really it sounds like it would be very helpful to see where Retrofit is hitting its limits when you use it with real life Drupal 7 sites.
Yeah. Yep.
So we'll be sure you can check the episode description for links to Retrofit and Matt's profile on GitHub. Matt, Chris, closing thoughts? Anything else to add?
I would just say, Matt, thanks for making my job a little bit easier. I have a carrot that I can dangle to potential clients to say, look, we've got an option here that doesn't require, 400 extra hours to get us to Drupal 10. We've got something that can help us maybe in the middle. So I'm thankful that you've started this project, and I'm hopeful that the community can rally behind it and make it really powerful. So these folks stuck on Drupal 7, have a bridge, so to speak.
I'm really excited for this project. I'm excited to see what happens in a few months as companies have time allocated to figure out what they're going to do with their Drupal 7 sites and evaluating this. And yeah, I'm excited.
Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for having me.